Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 81, Reestablishing Authority. With Achaeus gone, we can now turn our attention back to other fronts once again. What? You thought Antiochus III was just going to sit still? No chance. Once Achaeus was overthrown, Antiochus needed to squash Attalus I of Pergamon. After all, Attalus was the one both Seleucus III and Achaeus the Younger himself had set out to deal with. Attalus had admittedly been a friend of Antiochus due to recent events, and we know something should have been agreed upon after Achaeus died, but we don't know what. Regardless, eventually hostility flared up once again. After all, Antiochus would not be able to let the conquest of Anatolia go. For now though, things were tense, but at peace. The Seleucids were now also roughly back to what they had owned under the king's grandfather Antiochus II. In addition to Seleucid hegemony, Attalus, Pontus, Cappadocia and Bithynia were friendly or scared by other powers into siding with Antiochus. In other words, for now at least, the king didn't need to act in Anatolia. Instead, Armenia needed to be reminded of who exactly was in charge. In 212 BCE, we find Antiochus deep in Armenia, with the local king hiding away in somewhere called Arsaces and Antiochus getting ready to besiege the place. King Xerxes sent out a message asking to meet with Antiochus, afraid that his whole kingdom would fall if Arsaces did. Some in the Seleucid council argued that Xerxes should be captured during the interview, with others advising Antiochus to install his nephew Mithridates as king over the region. In the end, though, Antiochus simply agreed to a meeting. During the course of their discussions, he cut back some of the tribute debt that Armenia owed the empire, and Xerxes was wed to the young Antiochus, daughter of Seleucus II and sister of the king. The Armenian people were won over by the leniency of this agreement, and although I haven't written this down in my notes, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the flip side of this agreement is that Armenia would be a nice loyal client state. Eventually though, Xerxes would try and stir up trouble, and the king ordered his sister to kill off her husband. However, this is not the history of Armenia, so let's move on. The next theatre of war was the far east of the empire. Before we address this though, we need to talk about royal succession, and we've seen in the past that these two things have been linked together. When Antiochus III left Syria in 210 BCE, he made his 10-year-old son Antiochus co-ruler. Remember that we said Antiochus Jr. was born in 221 BCE, just a few years into his father's reign. We've seen this kind of association onto the throne as a backup during wars multiple times before. For example, we had Seleucus I and Antiochus I install their sons as co-kings. Regardless, Antiochus's eye was now firmly on Parthia and Bactria. In 210 BCE, a fleet sailed down the Euphrates carrying the Seleucid army east. In summer 209, Antiochus III had gotten as far as Media, which was, in provincial terms, the Seleucid bastion facing the east. We can tell that the Seleucid court was strapped for cash because Antiochus ransacked temples during his stay in the Median capital. This was something that hadn't really happened before. Edwin Bevan, in his history of the House of Seleucus, questions how wise this decision was. It may have earned Antiochus III 4,000 talents, but it also alienated a population already at the fringes of the empire. However, consequences whether direct or indirect in terms of provincial breaking away or resentment will have to wait as a story for another day. With that said, let's turn to Parthia. The ruler at this time was Arsaces II, son of Arsaces I. Edwin Bevan calls this ruler Arsaces III, but we've seen before that Parthian naming systems are a mess to wade through. Arsaces II was apprehensive. However, he was confident that Antiochus was only going to go as far as Media. After all, surely the long path without a river would stop him, right? Well, he was horrified to find out that, using wells along the way, Antiochus was in fact heading further east, hopping from well to well in a strategy that reminds me a bit of island hopping during World War II. I'm not sure how apt that comparison is, but the point is, you can imagine Antiochus jumping from well to well, glowering at the east, telling it that he was coming for it. For the first time since Seleucus II, we've got a Seleucid king messing about in the region. Arsaces, knowing that he was outmatched, sent men to block up wells and retreated to Hyrcania, abandoning his capital. Antiochus III swatted the Parthian saboteurs away and occupied the capital of Hecatompylus. Here, he stopped for a while to rest his men, before chasing after Arsaces. Despite the advice of the locals, Antiochus resolved to march through the mountains. I assume that these are the Zagros Mountains in, I believe, Iran, but Bevan doesn't clarify. It was a difficult march, filled with steep canyons and Parthians raining down attacks from above. However, Antiochus kept pushing and met the Parthians in battle at Labus, on a mountaintop. As a side note, in terms of cool settings for a battle, the top of a mountain definitely has to rank highly. Anyway, the mountain dwellers couldn't really do much against the full might of the Seleucid army and broke once they were attacked in the rear. Antiochus finished his march through the mountains and made straight for Hyrcania. He conquered Tambraca, which is where one of the Parthian monarch's palaces could be found. He then besieged the de facto capital of Syrinca and took it. At this juncture, Bevan bemoans that the veil falls back over our primary sources, limiting what we know. Antiochus probably accepted the surrender of Arsaces and made him a vassal the same way he'd done with the Armenians. So, just like that, Parthia was pacified. In the year of 208 to 207, Antiochus now made for Bactria. Diodotus II of Bactria had been overthrown since we last focused on the region, and been replaced with Euthydemus. I believe I mentioned when we were last in the region that Euthydemus would be relevant again. Well, that time is now. King Euthydemus camped at the river Arius, aiming to stop Antiochus crossing. Antiochus learned of where he was when the army was still 3 days away, and hurried his men to close the gap, making it in just 2 days. He arrived during the night, when most of Euthydemus' cavalry had gone back to camp. Therefore, Antiochus was able to move his men across comparatively easily. In fact, when dawn and Euthydemus' cavalry came, most of the men had already crossed. A battle was fought on the river Arius. During the fight, Antiochus III led the cavalry, which took on the majority of the assaulting Bactrians. Antiochus even had his horse killed out from under him and had multiple teeth struck out during the chaos. Suffice it to say, this fight cemented Antiochus III's reputation for bravery. Euthydemus' force was defeated and slunk back to camp. For his part, Euthydemus fled to Zariaspa, not wanting to risk another confrontation. However, Antiochus followed and started a siege. By the middle of 206 BCE, both men wanted a settlement. The Bactrian Greeks still felt solidarity with their Seleucid counterparts, a theme we have seen multiple times now during the reign of our young king. Euthydemus, originally from Magnesia, got a message to another Magnesian in the Seleucid camp asking him to request talks with Antiochus. Euthydemus argued that he was not at fault, given that Diodotus and his dynasty had been the ones to rebel against the throne. He had avenged this rebellion. This definitely seems to me like a desperate man using the idea of getting off on a technicality, but who am I to judge? Euthydemus also argued that his taking the throne of Bactria was so that there was not a vacuum of royal authority which the eastern barbarians could take advantage of. Again, seems a convenient excuse to me. For his part, Antiochus no longer wanted to be bogged down in Bactria. As we've seen happen with Seleucus II, he knew that being away from the western half of the empire for too long was a bad thing. So he made a deal, with the Magnesian from before acting as an intermediary. Euthydemus was vassalized and his war elephants were surrendered to the Seleucids. In exchange, Antiochus would acknowledge Euthydemus as a king and allied himself with Bactria. The deal was, apparently, made all the easier due to how charmed Antiochus was by Demetrius, son of Euthydemus. In fact, Demetrius was promised to be married to a daughter of Antiochus. This man would later become known as the one who conquered the west of India. With that said, we will turn our attentions to India next time, as will Antiochus. For now, let's just reflect on the fact that, for the first time in a long while, we have essentially the whole Seleucid Empire back under royal control. Did you miss this? I know I have. As always, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.